what happens clearly at the national level is the same. If the state dramatically increases the money supply in one way or another, which is clearly among the things that our friends at the Federal Reserve did during the early part of the 2000s, after a while it becomes apparent that the signals being sent by the increased money supply are inaccurate and a massive correction has to take place. Now, that's not the only dimension of the awful financial mess we're in right now, but I think it's a vital aspect of the problem. This is one of the things that the state does. It's one of the most obnoxious things the state does. The state really can't get away with doing anything else. Think about what's happened in recent years in the United States. The state goes to work on an enormous program of international military activity. A two-front war in the Middle East gets run. Well, imagine if the Bush administration had come to people and said, we'd like to raise your taxes to pay for this war. I think there would have been riots in the streets because the cost is so enormous. So what happens? We're simply going to borrow the money, and then we'll be able to pay that back, we hope, using the inflated currency that has been produced by a compliant Federal Reserve. Well, the fact that you're able to do that is the only thing that makes big, expensive programs like wars possible. People simply aren't going to tolerate paying up front for things like a two-front war in the Middle East. But if the state is able to fund the activities in which it's engaged by deferring those costs and paying for them ultimately in inflated currency, then it finds it easier to actually carry out programs like the ones that the U.S. government, first under Bush, now under Obama, have been actively involved in for close to a decade. Now, the Tannehills are surely right that a genuine monopoly, an entity that can exclude competitors from its market space, can't exist in a truly freed market. This is part of their celebration of what's great about freed markets. Now, and if we're just doing economic modeling, that's fine, right? I mean, we can always observe that if somebody's charging monopoly prices, those monopoly prices create a point of entry, an opportunity for a competitor to come in and undersell the fat monopolist. And so if this is just a voluntary situation, then the monopolist isn't going to be able to exclude the competitor, and so the monopolist's position really isn't sustainable. By contrast, if the monopolist is their helpful word, a coercive monopolist, and actually maintains a solo market position using force, then the monopolist certainly can exclude competitors, but what we have is no longer a genuinely freed market. So just remember, though, that what we have today is not a freed market, okay? The government is an active player. It provides all sorts of privileges for the well-connected. And so companies that enjoy monopolistic positions in our economy may well do so, not because of competitive excellence, but because of politically secured privilege. We can identify, I think, a whole range of privileges that are offered by the state that are relevant here. So think about limits on who can enter the banking business, and so on the ways in which capital can be acquired from for startups, okay? We might think about a situation here in which, as a number of folks in the 19th century American individualist anarchist movement suggested, we might have mutual banks in which people created banks, pledged their own assets to the banks, and borrowed against the shared assets for small startup projects. That's just not doable under current banking regulations. Think about tariffs, which preserve the market positions of politically favored businesses while harming consumers. Patents and copyrights, which redirect resources to big media companies and enable them to earn enormous rents on assets that would otherwise be not particularly valuable to them. Think about the monopoly the state itself exercises over the issuance of money or devolves to private bankers at the Fed. Think about licenses, which obviously again create enormous monopoly profits in areas like healthcare. The cost of healthcare is simply incomprehensible if you don't think about the impact of licensing, accreditation, and similar kinds of privileges. Vast subsidies to transportation infrastructure, which make it much easier for businesses that operate on long-distance shipping models to operate. These dramatically reshape the economic landscape. Similarly, there's a vast history of expropriation and state land grabbing in multiple places, but certainly for us it's especially important in Britain and the United States. You know, we just celebrated, as I recorded this lecture, we had just celebrated George Washington's birthday. And so it's well to point out that after the Revolutionary War, the U.S. Congress purported to give George Washington something close to 200,000 acres, I don't remember the exact figure, of land, supposedly unclaimed land. Now, I think we can obviously ask, where the heck did the Congress get the right to just claim this land and give it to Washington? But let's bracket that for the moment. Here's what's interesting. It gave Washington the land for distribution to his troops. Washington took approximately 50% of this land for himself, personally. I think about 80,000 acres. And much of the rest went to his closest subordinates, meaning that the soldiers who were supposed to have been rewarded by the Congress in this way got pretty much zilch. Okay? But that's typical of what happened in early America. There was this enormous process of land grabbing that went on, in which people just asserted control over land that they hadn't homesteaded, they hadn't invested in any meaningful way themselves. They just asserted that they controlled it and then used land grants from the state to exclude others and reap enormous profits. So, in any event, there are no monopolies in genuinely free markets. But what we have is nothing at all like a free market for all of these reasons. Everything from land grabs at the back of what's happened to exclusion from land, as in the English enclosure situation, to this whole range of ongoing privileges and monopolistic giveaways. So we have nothing at all like a free market, which is why, don't mean to be too nasty here, but that's why it is silly or disingenuous for the Tannehills to say that exploitation by big business is a, quote, non-existent dragon, and then to defend this claim by referring to what happens in a free market, because we don't have a free market. And so exploitation by big business can be very much a real feature of our world, even if neither exploitation nor, I'm inclined to say, really big business would be part of a truly free market. Bigness itself, I think, is a product of state subsidies and monopolies. Now, the worst monopoly, of course, we can talk about all these other monopoly problems, but the worst monopoly, of course, is the monopoly of force exercised by the government. The state's monopoly power is, in fact, at the root of all other monopolies. And so, what the Tannehills do in Chapter 4 is to set the stage for their subsequent discussion by seeking to undermine the credibility of the state. Okay? Now, remember what I said in Lecture 1. We can see the Tannehills here as offering a possibility proof. Okay? How do we know it's possible? Guess what? Here's a way in which it could be possible. Voluntary cooperation can accomplish the things the state is supposed to accomplish, so who needs the state? That's really the underlying argument. Now that's a great question, and the Tannehills go a long way toward justifying the answer they want to give, which is no one. Nobody needs the state. But recognize there are often two distinct questions that get asked here, both of which have to be answered. One of them is, does the state do any good? The other is the state legitimate? Does it have any right to rule? And the Tannehills correctly emphasize that in our culture, it's common to view the government as legitimate because it is, quote, democratic. Now, the first thing to recognize, of course, is that the government isn't democratic. That is, it's ruled by the power elite, not by the rest of us, and they present voters with a very, very narrow range of choices. Okay? We get Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We don't get dramatically different options, and then we get, this is my favorite part, we get a compliant group of media hacks who exaggerate dramatically the differences between politicians on a small range of issues to convince you that you've got a big, big, momentous choice to make, when the reality is that much of the time you're choosing people who share the same consensus about war, about the restriction of civil liberties, about corporate bailouts, about the things that matter most to the corporate elite. Then you can go away and argue about details.